Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 59. Today is part 4 in my series on the California Wine Association, the Calamity Edition. Last time we saw the CWA gobble up their competitors after the end of the wine wars. They absorbed wineries, vineyards, and wine houses. When they couldn't purchase the entire company, they would get half. Allowing companies to operate with the veil of independence would keep the antitrust folks away. It was all fair game, and they came out with control of over 2/3 of the wine in the state. Today, we see how they do in a battle against Mother Nature. Before we start, I'd like to let you know there is a Patreon you can donate to if you'd like to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free. If you don't want to or can't, that's okay too. Maybe you could tell a friend who would have an interest in listening also. Thanks. Here we go. The North American and Pacific plates collide just outside of San Francisco. Granite from the Sierra Nevada mountains can be found here, making the 300-mile journey in millions of years, or who knows how long. The plates come together here as much as they can. It's not an exact thing, and the San Andreas Fault is wide and its impact wider. Wednesday, April 18th, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., everyone who wasn't awake was soon awoken by the earthquake. Reporter James Hopper described it as, quote, like a terrier shaking a rat. As the shaking stopped, people looked around assessing the damage done. Much of the waterfront in San Francisco is reclaimed from the bay. Rocks and trash and gold rush ships were covered in bay mud, sand, and dirt from the leveling of San Francisco's many hills to expand the city's footprint. There's a spot near the Transamerica Pyramid today where you can follow some of the original coastline. It's about 5 or 6 big city blocks in from the current coastline. This landfill turned to mush during the earthquake, liquefying from the force of the shaking. Many of the quick and cheaply constructed wooden buildings tipped over or collapsed, somewhat gracefully coming apart. The bricks were another matter. Most of those dropped instantly. Poorly constructed walls and chimneys came crashing down. Many of the buildings built from steel with stone facades had the stone completely fall off of them. Some of the buildings that were well built and on solid ground held up, the brick or concrete construction doing its job. Many, though, had been building with wood, thinking it's safer in an earthquake. Fires broke out around the city from ruptured gas mains, candles that had tipped over during the shaking, or like the hugely destructive ham and eggs fire, from damaged chimneys. Fires roared down Sansom Street at the base of Telegraph Hill, down Mission Street and 3rd Street, through Hayes Valley and Civic Center. Of the 28 wine houses in San Francisco when the Great Quake struck, many were controlled by the CWA. But there were independents as well, some with names still familiar to us today. Cresta Blanca, Ruby Hill, Inglenook, Tokelon, Gunlock Bunshoe, and others had offices and warehouses in the city. Many were located in the waterfront districts, on Front Street or Battery Street, some with piers running into the bay. Most of the others were south of Market off of Bryant or Townsend Streets, close to the railroads. April, when the quake hit, was one of the busiest times for the San Francisco wine houses. Wine was consistently shipped this month to Hawaii, China, Japan, Mexico, Singapore, Costa Rica, Canada, Tahiti, Panama, the Philippines, England, New York, and New Orleans, and many more. The cellars were filled with nearly all of the 1905 vintage sent in from the country cellars, and was now resting and aging, ready to be blended and bottled and sent around the world. A woman named Kathleen Norris later gave her remembrances of the earthquake.
Things racket and roll as if you were crossing the channel on the 3rd of February. As a matter of fact, it's a rather quiet performance. There's a deep, earthy sound that's subterranean, very disturbing, but it's just a matter of a gentle clicking and clacking and rattling, but it's everywhere. Every picture on the wall is going tack, tack, tack. Every little ashtray is going tick, tack, tack. Every plate, every chair, everything movable in the house is keeping up that unearthly clatter. Nothing deafening about it, nothing rocking about it. But the good solid earth, the one thing you've counted on, is throwing you down. And we said, what is this? It must be an earthquake. And of course, and then we could hear the voices of other people who had run out of their houses. And you could hear up and down the roads, earthquake, it's an earthquake. And so we walked up Van Ness on this glorious, beautiful spring morning, and we saw our city die. It was something to see. The great, heavy, slow rolls of smoke that were joining hands as they went up. And the people, very cheerful, very philosophical. There was no screaming, but of course they were pushing baby buggies, and they were dragging children's carts, and they were getting where they could, even wheelbarrows. There wasn't any screaming or any panic, but very enterprising. San Francisco had set up a coffee stand, I should say about Franklin, somewhere up there. There was a nice little coffee stand on the sidewalk selling coffee, and there was a man selling souvenirs of the earthquake on the morning of April 18th, 1906.
We have accounts from some other survivors, too.
So she ran what they'd call a soup kitchen now, out there on the front for all these people who were straggling by with baby carriages full of their possessions, and it was 2 or 3 days after Easter, and they'd have hat boxes with the Easter bonnets, probably the only things they'd save, parrot cages, and all sorts and conditions of things. The little boys' red wagons full of what they thought they could save, and in the most outrageous costumes you've ever seen in your life, because they just put on anything they happened to have over their night clothes, or just the first thing they picked up to get out of the houses.
And early in the morning, 5 o'clock, the house began to shake. And my mother said that cats had been running around all night making a lot of noise. Pretty soon Father said, we mustn't stay here because there's a fire that's coming up into the city. It started down near the waterfront. So he got together some of the neighbors and some of the people from the church. This little group that I was in was my second sister. And there were crowds that were pushing us up. We were supposed to go down toward the ferry. But there were so many people trying to get away from the fire. So they thought the thing to do was to go up. And sometimes it wasn't easy to get around these places that had the houses all fallen down. We could feel the fire on our faces, even several blocks away. My sister tried to keep us away from the fire because we were walking so slowly because of this lady. And that was the first time I ever saw her cry, because she was responsible for us. And here was the food and the water. At nighttime, we had no place to sleep or to rest. So I remember up around Taylor Street, we lay down, couldn't really lie down, but we sat as well as we could. See, I had a little brother and a little sister, and they hung on tightly to me. And they were such good children. They didn't cry, even when they were knocked down. I was 7. I felt quite responsible and quite a big sister. So they would not cry, but they'd look up tearfully at me and hold my hand closer. We 3 just held on to each other because we mustn't be parted from our big sister, from this lady. And it was 2 days before we got to the ferry. There was a long line of people waiting to get onto the ferry. The whole city, of course, was trying to get away from the burning city over to Oakland. So finally, we got across the ferry over to Oakland. There was the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. I always remember them. They were so good. They were so kind. They gave us each a cup of coffee with carnation cream and sugar, and each a donut. And that was the first real food we had had that was the 3rd day. And oh my, that tasted so good. And when I smell coffee now, hot coffee with carnation cream, I can always remember that.
And understood it was very serious that the city was burning. So my brother, he got the idea that maybe the cadets could be helpful as joined the military over there, prevent looting supposedly and that sort of thing, and patrol the streets. I never carried a gun with real bullets. That's the first time any of us, I think, had ammunition with our guns. The city was burning, and then come in above the fire and carrying these big rifles. And one of my classmates in the cadets shot himself through the foot. That was the only issue, because he wasn't used to having a rifle. But it was quite an experience, and that 3 days I saw many things.
We have some accounts of winemen that were on the scene also. I think most of what they say is especially vivid. Louis M. Martini was 9 at the time. He recounted the story 64 years later. What I love about this quote is that he was so close to where many of the wine houses in the city were located. He was just down the street from the Montgomery block and within a couple blocks of many wine firms. Quote, I was in the fish market on Merchant Street. I pretty nearly got killed. It came pretty strong, on 58 seconds long, 2 undulatory and 1 oscillatory. Buildings were going up and down. You could see the Tower of the Hall of Justice going up and down. Some buildings fell down, but not the Montgomery block. I ran from Merchant Street way up to Kearny to Portsmouth Square. Then I went back to my wagon. I had an old horse, an old mare, Julia, and just before the earthquake, she started throwing her head. I said, "What's the matter, Julia?" And then for 58 seconds it lasted. Nothing to do. Everything collapsed. The fish market, half a block down between Washington and Merchant Streets, came down too. The city was starting to burn. I started home. Unquote. As he started home to the Bayview district, he gave some survivors a ride in his wagon because they agreed to purchase all of the clams he was supposed to have sold at the fish market that day. Clams his father and he had dug out of the bay mud that morning. Him and Julia ended up making 4 or 5 trips back and forth from the Palace Hotel to the ferry with survivors. Antonio Pirelli Manetti was one of those that ended up stationed in the city as volunteers were called for. He had been in Healdsburg during the actual shaking. I'll let him tell it.
So I was assigned in Long Beach to take care of all the movement to remove everybody from North Beach. So I was the authority then. And the first thing I did was to commandeer all the boats. They pointed it at, in Auckland, they would feed you at the pier or at the landing of the ferry boat, things like that. Mm-hmm. And the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe would give you a free ticket to any part of the United States and Canada. So people start to take living and going east. And in Auckland, they had the tremendous tables full of food where you could feed yourself. So I started taking people across. Although they would move from North Beach, take them to Auckland because they were going to blow North Beach up. To stop the fire, they had to blow the blocks, one block after another. The army got in, so we got the order to move everybody out. And I remember very well, the moon was beautiful, full moon. And then San Francisco started to clear up, the army went in, the court-martial was the law. Declared the court-martial in San Francisco. A few people got killed, and they shoot anybody that was caught stealing. People would go there and try to get the rings out of people that had been killed in the debris, and they shoot them right there, and then didn't ask any question.
Charles Bundschuh of the Gunlock Bundschuh Winery wrote to his brother on the Sunday after the quake with it fresh in his mind. Their warehouse was located at 434 Bryant Street, between 3rd and 4th Streets. Although still independent, their offices were located near various CWA-controlled firms. Quote, Walter and Carl started down and went to the warehouse, finding no speakable damage from the shock and foremen and crew redeeming the damage. The fire of the Mission and 3rd Street location had grasped the Opera House and the beautiful Aronson building, working its way towards the Palace Hotel, but not southward, unquote. Later on, perhaps an hour, they would return to the warehouse after surveying some of the surrounding area. Quote, They started out again to the warehouse. It was then known that the city was without water. Found the foreman and his nephew on hand. The crew ran out of the building when another severe shock at about 9 o'clock made the building shriek and apparently unsafe, and Carl started to pack up the book and papers of the office. Unfortunately, a puncheon of red wine was shaken from its saddle of the third row right above my desk, and the claret flooded everything." Unquote. This would soon be the least of their worries as the wind whipped up the flames and fire spread. Quote, "In the meantime, the fire had run out Mission Street, consumed the Palace Hotel, Spreckles Building, working its way from Sansom Street through the wholesale districts. From out Mission, it crossed over to Brannan. Then the afternoon western wind drove it down again to 3rd Street like a furious wall of fire. Carl had closed the building and sat with Chris, the foreman, on the opposite house steps. The western firewall stood nobly for a time, but the flames from Silver Street soon engulfed the building. The heat became unbearable, and Carl found his way home, passing C. Schilling on Brannan Street and the mail dock, which perhaps an hour later, together with St. Mary's Hospital, Sailor's Home, and that entire corner were turned into an impenetrable furnace of fire and heat. In the meantime, Walter assisted at August Schelling to check the attacks of the falling cinders with wet sacks and other precautions. He thought the old Kohler and Froling building would protect them. Our building fell at 5 o'clock the first day. When Carl carried the news to our home, my tears flowed incessantly." Unquote. So there, in the amount of time they could walk between the buildings, multiple wine firms lost everything. The Kohler and Froling building at Folsom and 2nd served as the first headquarters of the CWA. It was still relatively new, described by one as a perfect forest of giant ovals and tanks. Over 3 million gallons of cooperage were stored there. Its destruction was near total from the fire. The August Schelling building was kitty corner to it. These wine buildings and their cellars were reduced to piles of bricks and barrel hoops. The Bundschuh family were representative of what we spoke of at the top of the series. Homes lost, belongings buried, escaping the city on a ferry in the middle of the night. Those buried belongings either burned or looted. They would lose around 1 million gallons of wine. Quote, "They were the pride of the house, and like many other precious things that were lost at that time, are beyond recall." Unquote. Of course, Bundschuh was not a CWA-affiliated winery, but Charles' account is the best that exists for the wine industry to my knowledge. S. Lackman & Co. was not far away at 453 Brannan Street. This was one of the sadder buildings to lose. It was the main shipping depot for the CWA, close to both wharves and the trains. Over 2 million gallons of wine were stored there, and if you remember, it had an 80,000-gallon sherry tank that was very probably the largest in the world. It held enough sherry to fill 27 rail cars. 50 men worked in the cooperage making repairs, and another 30 worked in the 100 by 150-foot bottling plant. One of the more stirring photos of the aftermath is of the large stone bust of Samuel Lackman that until that day was mounted high on the building overlooking one of the CWA's most important locations. It would come to rest on the bricks of the fallen walls, the nose all busted up, but otherwise looking just like the man still. Charles Bundschuh's writing returned here with a poem he penned about the bust of his old competitor lying in the rubble. When the whirlpool of fire and flames burst forth, taking block after block in its embrace, when from east to south and west to north, the demon of hell did race. The Holocaust also reached the Lackman block and hugged it to utter destruction. While proudly defying the earthquake shook, the fire end had doomed its reduction. When the block bearing the Lackman face, with a self-made man's jovial smile, fell thundering down from its lofty place, it landed right on top of the pile. Old Lackman always landed on top, when the burdens of life he did share. Now when he landed, he came to a stop, on the great rock pile hurled through the air. In the giant stone face, true to life, that faced the elements in their strife, a grim look in the eyes seemed to say, "My, but I had a bad fall today." The S. Lackman Winery was nearly lost 10 years earlier in a quick-moving fire that wiped out 2 city blocks. The brick walls of the building repelled the flames that time, and the shingles didn't catch fire. But it wasn't without excitement. Quote, "The wind seemed to be controlled by a devilish imp who was sporting with it in a horrible way." Unquote. Most of the workers returned to battle the fire. They were able to saturate the roof with water. so much that it was running down to the engine room below and threatening to flood it. The engine room men finally had to return to safety and shut the engines down, which also cut off the water supply. Someone instead connected the hoses to a 10,000-gallon wine tank, and using the still operational wine pumps, they flooded the roof and outside walls again with wine, giving that brick building a different reddish hue as it repelled the fire. This was a small price to pay to save the rest of the 1.2 million gallons residing in the winery. Unfortunately, in 1906, they were not as lucky. The smaller cellars around town, some in wooden buildings, were complete losses. Even at the larger houses, barrels and puncheons were tipping over, rolling around, or breaking apart during the initial shaking. 25 of the 28 wine houses in the city were destroyed. Some houses came through relatively unscathed. Inglenook, Tokelon, and Sea Shilling luckily hadn't yet brought their wines of the 1905 harvest to San Francisco. The French-American Wine Company on Harrison Street and the St. George Vineyard at 8th and Brandon came through relatively unscathed as well. Here's Antonio Pirelli Minetti again giving us some great info on the wine losses.
The earthquake came and destroyed all the wineries in San Francisco. The wine just was lost completely. All of them, no one. So dry wine in those days was about 11 to 12 cents a gallon. The only one left out was in the country that didn't belong to the companies. That was the dry one went up to 28 cents a gallon. Frank Schmidt had about 250,000 gallons of wine. He had a contract with the California Association for 12 cents. Fopian owns the place now. So Frank Schmidt was an old man, 79 years old. He wanted to go back to Germany. And I bought his wine, I think for 18, 19 cents, something like that, I don't remember. So California Association boycotted him. But in those days, like California Association, Kansas Colony, that was before the earthquake, Lackman, Jacoby, all the Schlesinger brothers, and all those big companies carried the wine 15 years, for 15 years. California Association had the wines that was 15 years old, maybe a couple of million gallons, were taken good care of. The wine was bottled without much processing, practically just a filtration, and then it was put into the bottle, no sediment, nothing. The wine in those days were made like in the old country that were made 100 years ago.
As the fires roared and spread, it gave chance to some of the great stories of wine heroism. We've given the amount of wine lost in the city as 15 million gallons a couple times. That's the official number. Most would say it was higher, maybe even twice as high. The wine men of the city had fully stocked cellars. The clubs and bars and fine hotels also. San Francisco was always a drinking city. Paul Masson had a large retail store at the Palace Hotel that burned to the ground. The official number also doesn't take into account the large number of Italian families living mostly in the North Beach neighborhood. Andrea Sabarbaro tells of those who lived in the neighborhood dumping wine on their roofs by the bucketful and soaking down the siding. They even laid wine-soaked gunny sacks on the roof if they had them handy, trying their best to fend off any advancing flames. Most of this was in vain, and the neighborhood was hit hard. More successful was the Italian Swiss colony and their building at Battery and Greenwich. It was a substantial building, 3 stories tall and made of steel, brick, and terracotta. It rested on piles sunk deep into the bay mud and a concrete foundation. The location was ideal, near the water and wharves and also the railroad. In fact, a spur track ran into the cellar for easy loading and unloading of wine. The brick cellar held 2 million gallons, although it could hold up to 3 when needed. Underneath was a natural spring with a well to supply the building with water. Sabarbaro sped from Asti to San Francisco after the earthquake, determined to save his structure and wine. Alongside P.C. Rossi and Rossi's twin sons, Edmund and Robert, they battled for 3 days. Using the building's steam generator and steam-powered pump and wine hoses, they pumped the roof full of water while nearby buildings burned and kicked embers onto the soaked roof. The Army detonation team nearly decided to blow up the building. The fallen bricks would hopefully create a fire break on the waterfront. Sabarbaro was somehow able to change the Army's mind and guide a firefighting crew to other nearby buildings. And although those buildings couldn't all be saved, The flames were no longer licking at the Italian-Swiss colony building. The building still stands looking much the same, right at the foot of Telegraph Hill near Levi's Plaza. Louis Wetmore, the son of Charles Wetmore, was the young manager of the George West Winery in Stockton. He had been there 10 years already, since the age of 14, working his way up. 3 days after the quake, he arrived in the city with rented grain barges, most from the city of Crockett across the bay. He had taken off in his buggy upon hearing the news, roaring around the Stockton area in search of barges to rent. Though the cellars of the Lackman and Jacoby building at 3rd and Bryant still stood, they were in a terrible shape. The fire had overrun the building, charring or burning up all the wooden vats and cooperage. The sewer line was clogged from debris, making the cellar into a 2-million-gallon sea of wine and rubble and charred wood. Bottles floated by. And just for comparison, that's about 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of wine floating around with debris. Laying hoses and pipes down 3rd Street, and with the aid of extra fire engine pumps, nobody is quite sure how he was able to get access to these. He and his vineyard men filled barge after barge with wine. Rented steamships towed the barges to their giant El Pinal winery in Stockton, where the wine was again pumped into holding tanks. Obviously, it couldn't be sold as wine anymore, but could still be distilled into brandy. The aptly named Charles Ashe, who we met a little earlier, became the second hero of this rescue mission. He was a chemist for the CWA, usually working to confirm Henry Lackman or A.R. Morrow's tastes were correct. The wine was stored at El Pinal until an agreement with insurance companies could be worked out. The first distillates made by other chemists were extremely smoky and undrinkable. Ashe was called down to El Pinal and told not to return until he had drinkable brandy. His goal in the laboratory at El Pinal was to make a fortifying brandy, used to up the alcohol and halt fermentation on their sweet wines. Through trial and error, he noticed that when the wine was made more oxidized and acidic, the smoke receded and the quality was improved. After treating the wine with sulfuric acid and potassium permanganate, he was able to distill it into something usable to fortify the sweet wines made at El Pinal. The Caua cellars at 3rd and Townsend Street stored 250,000 bottles of wine before the earthquake. Much of it was lost like so much of the other wine. The first 5 rows of bottles were melted into solid glass. Of the remaining, only 1 in every 5 hadn't had its cork pop out. 35,000 intact bottles were supposedly found after the flames had died down and everything was allowed to cool. The CWA promoted these souvenir bottles in ads. Quote, "Old wines are better than new, milder, riper, finer in taste and aroma. Old wines inspire to wit and wisdom and speech and laughter. Old wines give the most prandial speaker his theme and inspiration. Old wines conduce to the cultivation of friendships. Old wines aid digestion, assist the alimentary process, and develop good feelings. Old wines grace the table of monarch and statesman. Old wines are sought by those with cultivated taste. Old wines, rare vintages, demand big prices the world over. This is an opportunity none ever had before, an opportunity none will ever have again. The wines we saved, in bottles from the debris of our billings, were mellowed and ripened and aged by the heat." Unquote. Prices for a case of 12 quarts were Claret $6.50, Zinfandel $7.50, Burgundy $8, Cabernet $9, La Loma $12, Hillcrest $12.50, Private Stock Claret $10, Sauterne $9.50, Haute Sauterne $11.50, Sherry $8.50, Angelica $7.50. This is one of the rare times, possibly the only time, that the CWA would sell directly to consumers. Wines were not relabeled, but sent in the same condition they were recovered in, and wrapped in a page of the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper in which they ran a story of this titled, "Wine Mellowed by the Fire." An excerpt from the article. Quote, "All of the dry wines were found to have been much benefited, but when the Burgundy came to be tasted, it was discovered that the California product had achieved a mellowness which surpassed that of the far-famed vintage of France. The sweet wine varieties were even more advantaged by the heating process, and this was especially noticeable in the case of the sherries, which have nothing to envy of their Spanish progenitor. The connoisseur may enjoy the results, but it is certain that the winemakers will prefer to continue their normal manner of producing their stock." Unquote. I just want to add that even those who know this event the best have never seen a bottle or label of any of these wines. The CWA had another stock of top wines set aside and aging in their cellars. These bottles they had planned to release at around 10 years of age to show the world the aging potential of California wines. Since the start of the wine industry in California, winemakers and consumers had complained about wines being released too young, mostly on necessity. They argued that the wines would reach the level of the French if only they were allowed to age and mature properly. This was the CWA's chance to do it. Unfortunately, this entire stock was lost in the fire. Some say this was the true wine-related disaster of the earthquake. Older blending stocks had also been lost. These tanks of aged wine could add complexity and help keep the gigantic blends consistent for consumers, a cornerstone of the CWA philosophy. Damage wasn't limited to San Francisco only. Sonoma County got hit especially hard. Their large winery at Geyserville needed repairs, and the Kohler and Froling Tokay winery in Glen Ellen, built from stone, sustained massive damages and closed. The property would later be purchased by Jack London and is now part of the Jack London State Historic Park. You can still see some of the winery ruins. The Isaac de Turk winery and its 1 million gallons of storage were destroyed and had to be closed also. The Buena Vista winery had 3 of its famous tunnels cave in. The giant 500,000-gallon storage tank of the Italian-Swiss colony at Asti cracked. When repaired, it was now 3 sections and down in capacity to 300,000 gallons. Over in Napa, the French-American wine company, who escaped the San Francisco event unscathed, had their premium Brun and Chai winery in Oakville lose its foundation, spilling over 100,000 gallons of wine. The Greystone winery stood firm, although some of its tunnels caved in also. A few CWA chairmen lost their homes, including Charles Carpy and Klaus Schilling. The independent Behringer Brothers winery also sustained heavy damage with a wall falling down and damage to the family home. The Charles Krug winery sustained light damage as well. Most of the locations further south in Santa Clara Valley and the Santa Cruz Mountains came through better, but not all of them. The gigantic 1.5 million gallon Gallegos Palmdale winery in Fremont sustained a total collapse. We learned much more about this interesting facility in episode 29. Henry Lackman had recently purchased it along with the surrounding homes and retired there. It had spent just over 1 year as a CWA winery. As we heard back in 29, its tunnels and hillside location were actually dug into the fault line. It was this ridge of the fault that allowed the facility to be built. Some of its ruins are still visible in Fremont. After the smoke cleared, the CWA was a little battered and bruised, but still there. Their books were in tip-top shape. That's what having an accountant in charge gets you. And they were still financially sound and able to carry on paying bills and rebuilding the empire. Lines of credit were still open and valid. That's what having bankers as large investors gets you. The Banco Italo-Americano run by Andrea Sabarbaro and the Bank of Italy run by A.P. Giannini supplied the industry but also San Francisco citizens with loans based on handshakes. Within a couple weeks, wine was being shipped to the east again. The general rebuilding in San Francisco started nearly at once. Wines from Ohio and Missouri were able to make slight headways into some markets for a moment with California wine thrown into chaos. Prices took an immediate jump. 10 cents more a gallon. Brandy prices increased too. 15 million gallons of wine down the drain or burnt up in a fire will do that. The Italian-Swiss colony advanced their prices 7.5% per gallon for sherry and Madeira, 5% for other sweet wines, and dry red wines 10% per gallon. Some Southern California dealers raised prices more quickly to take advantage of the situation. Wines that were going for 25 cents a gallon a couple days before were now 40 cents. From some dealers, they even doubled. The Italian Vineyard Company, or IVC, one of the only true competitors to the CWA remaining, noted that they were in no hurry to sell their wines and were mostly selling to their regular customers at usual prices. Other dealers were attempting to purchase stock from their fellow winemakers in order to restock their cellars and hope for even higher prices to come. Many of the other San Francisco wine firms quickly moved across the bay to Oakland. We see them pop up on Broadway, East 12th Street, and San Pablo Avenue. One of these was the Cresta Blanca winery, where Charles Wetmore hoped that America would turn out to support the California wine industry in this time of need. CWA lost around $5 million in its cellars alone. Lachman and Jacoby another $1 million, C. Schilling another $1 million, other houses $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 each. Because of its size and geographic diversity, the CWA was able to piece together wine from Santa Clara Valley, the Central Valley, and Napa Valley and get around 200 carloads to the eastern part of the U.S. only 6 weeks after the quake. The Uncle Sam Winery in Napa had a large stock of bulk quality wine that they had produced from Central Valley grapes that was totally undamaged. Much of the wine was from a lightly aged 1905 vintage, but it was sound wine. Lachman and Jacoby rushed construction on 10 acres of land in Petaluma they had purchased. Located close to the Petaluma River and the railroad, it consisted of 8 buildings with cooperage for their small oak barrels, sherry warehouse, bonded room, 2 large storage cellars, and more. The same year, they purchased another property just down the street and soon installed 18 glass-lined sherry tanks, a huge 200,000-gallon tank, and enough others to give the little facility city 4 million gallons of wine storage. Construction was of brick and notably both fire and earthquake resistant. The 160 by 50-foot sherry room with 320,000-gallon capacity was completed in only a few months. The winery and the firm's cooperage would follow. They had easy access to shipping by rail or water here. We've talked about their relationship with New Orleans a lot, and for that great customer, they made a wine tailored to the tastes of the city. Their wines were mostly purchased by Italian immigrants, and a light, claret-style table wine, off-dry with enough SO2 to keep it stable, was just the ticket. It was labeled Vino Siciliano. Like we mentioned earlier, that alcohol and high SO2 was just the thing to mix with New Orleans water. The CWA would actually sell some of their undamaged bulk stock to other winemakers and firms who had lost all of theirs in the calamity, quote, in order that they may retain their identity, unquote. Morgan even offered for the CWA to pay dividends shortly after the fire. However, shareholders voted to have it delayed until insurance situations were worked out. They set the prices of Napa grapes for that year at $23 to $27.50 a ton. A lot of wine was lost during the earthquake, but culture and a way of life in the city also. Many families that moved out of the city never returned, taking to their new homes in Oakland or San Rafael. Many others were homeless or living in the tent cities that popped up in the Presidio, or the 200-square-foot earthquake shacks that Horace Greeley helped design by taking his inspiration from the Arctic shacks he built as a young man. The San Francisco newspapers combined to print the Call, Chronicle, Examiner paper jointly in the aftermath. Earthquake and Fire, San Francisco in Ruins ran their first headline. The Pacific Wine and Spirits Review, published by R.M. Wood, relocated to L.A. temporarily to continue printing issues and following the wine losses. A combined April and May 1906 Calamity Edition did so much good in capturing the feeling of many at the time, as well as keeping track of the destruction, reconstruction, and changes throughout San Francisco during this horrible time. It's probably fitting that other magazines of the day devoted letters and well wishes to him and his paper, in hopes that it would recover like the phoenix of old. The arts also. Take the Copa restaurant. It was a mainstay of San Francisco's bohemian scene. Located on the corner of the Monkey Block or Montgomery Block building, where its chef and owner, Giuseppe, aka Joseph, or Papa Copa, presided over a group of artists, writers, sculptors, and actors. He had previously cooked at the legendary Poodle Dog restaurant, and if you had $1.75, you could get the house specialty of chicken and a coconut. If you didn't have $1.75, that was okay too. There was a full meal for 35 cents with salad, meat, pasta, hot bread, cheese, fruit, wine, and coffee. If you didn't have 35 cents, that was okay too. Credit was always extended to his artist friends. The menus printed for others were usually twice the price anyways of those reserved for the bohemians. In return, they repaid him by painting a legendary fresco on Copa's walls. It started with some chalk scribbles, then a giant 5-foot lobster on an island labeled Bohemia. Something terrible is about to happen, written alongside it and surrounded by 2 nudes, a man and a woman. Above these, a border with the names or nicknames of regulars. Above that, stenciled black cats in a French style, stalking their way around the room. Some caricatures, too. Father Time appeared to be holding the wall clock in one hand and a jug of wine in the other. It was probably Chianti, from Italy. Chianti was always the house wine and Copa's favorite, and from the area he grew up in. Every evening the door would be locked at 9 and the wine would flow freely. Jack London, Porter Garnett, Xavier Martinez, Maynard Dixon, James Hopper, who we heard from earlier, or the poet George Sterling, or maybe Ambrose Bierce could be there as Copa wrote out the next day's menu with a large and showy quill pen. A black cat that may or may not have existed would roam around the restaurant. If you remember the episode with Christopher Buckley, the Monkey Block building did in fact survive the quake and the fire. It didn't survive the looters, though, who raided and destroyed it as smoke and rubble filled the streets. 2 weeks later, Copa was tracked down in one of those Presidio tents. He and the Bohemians all dined together for the last time in the rubble, lit only by a few candles. Someone had arranged a pass from General Funston. The door was still guarded by a soldier armed with a rifle against further looting as the candles struggled to light the room. The piano wasn't much anymore, but it could still ring out a few misshapen notes while everyone ate cold ravioli, drank wine, and celebrated what they had. A funny thing happened after the earthquake. It was swept under the rug or minimized. Most would agree that there was a great fire, but the earthquake wasn't such a big deal, was it? They attempted to rebrand it as the Great Fire. Many called it the Calamity. The San Francisco Chronicle, as well as some city leaders, didn't want to scare away prospective businesses from the city. A city prone to large landscape-altering earthquakes would scare away investors and businessmen. But what city hadn't had the occasional fire? Insurance companies attempted to deny most payouts. The CWA and Percy Morgan started in on these insurance companies, many of which were closing up shop in California and moving on. They had the $1 million policy of their 3rd and Bryant Street cellars covered relatively quickly, just a few months. The insurance company received 2 million gallons of that ashy, boiled wine in return. The insurance company was unwilling to pay to dispose of that ashy wine rescued by Louis Wetmore, and basically told the CWA, if you want it, you can have it. And that's where Charlie Ash's distilling skills that we heard about earlier came into play. Other claims dragged on, some going through the winding legal system. By 1910, the CWA and most others had gotten something close to what they were owed after the courts stepped in. Arguments about whether the CWA's 5th Street building was destroyed by fire or by earthquake went on, even reaching the Supreme Court, who finally sided with the CWA that it was in fact the fire that destroyed it. Earthquake insurance policies weren't something that anyone had at the time, so this was a big deal for them. There are some stories of residents lighting their homes on fire, having already pulled what they could from the rubble. Other stories of shopkeepers inviting crowds in to loot the store before it was consumed by the inevitable fires. To add insult to injury, the giant Calwa facility in Fresno was destroyed by an explosion and following fire just a few months later. It caused more uncertainty and caused large wine sales to nearly stop completely for a short time while the situation was reassessed. The explosion started in the winery sherry rooms from fumes generated in the sherry-making process. The brick building, 400,000 gallons of stored sherry, some of the association's best, as well as the pasteurization plant, cooperage, the sherry oven, fermentation plant, and a warehouse building that contained not just supplies and machinery for that winery, but for the other wineries in the area was destroyed. It had been rebuilt only 10 years before and was one of the largest wineries in the world. Another battle with insurance companies would take place over whether it was on fire before the explosion or not. Charred pieces of wood from the sherry building were found on surrounding buildings, indicating the fire started before the explosion. The damage was estimated at around $300,000 either way. The CWA struggled to keep up with the demand as they tried to fulfill large orders to the east when they had the lowest qualities and quantities of wine. Further affecting the 1906 vintage was the large amount of sulfur, or SO2, burned up in the San Francisco fires, enough that it became scarce during the growing season. Most vineyards had to go without dusting their vines that year. Late-season rains combined with the loss of sulfur for the crop resulted in a heavy mildew pressure for some regions. Sonoma was hit especially hard. Torn disease would affect the wines from this year, according to Charles Ash. Fermentations were an issue, and so was volatile acidity, and bottles would explode seemingly at random the next couple years from this vintage. Because of these issues and the amount of wine lost, prices would jump for the 1906 harvest. Growers were getting $30 per ton in the Fountain Grove area of Sonoma. A further hindrance was people to pick the grapes. For the past few years, the Chinese labor that was so easy to come by disappeared for grape growers, not just in Sonoma, but other regions as well. In the Sacramento area, they disappeared virtually overnight. Other laborers had fled the area also. The crop this year wouldn't be a large one, but every grape was needed to replace what was lost in the fires. Napa grapes were equaling and even surpassing the Sonoma grapes in prices. Tokay grapes shipped fresh from Lodi to New York received their highest price ever, $2,676 for one carload. The newly passed Pure Food and Drug Law complicated things even more. The CWA, Lachman and Jacoby, and the Italian-Swiss colony all forced the wineries they were purchasing from to supply a warrant of purity. It would be a sworn statement that only pure grape juice was used, and no beet or cane sugar, glucose, colorants, or other adulterants were used in the wine. Morgan and the CWA leadership had a choice to make. Rebuild in a damaged San Francisco with their facilities spread around town with large offices and multiple cellars holding, say, 1, 2, 3 million gallons each that needed to be blended, bottled, and shipped around the world. On the other hand, they could potentially consolidate and eliminate some redundancies and fix some of their other pain points. With the exception of the Brandon Street warehouse, the CWA wouldn't rebuild in San Francisco. This warehouse would be used as a halfway house to consolidate some shipments and as temporary storage. They would also keep the 180 Townsend Street offices that were spared by the earthquake and fire they called Casa Calva, remodeling it as a general office building. At least 15 million gallons of wine were lost in the calamity. 2/3 of that belonged to the CWA, along with nearly all of their cellars and offices. Morgan and the team had some work to do. Thanks for listening today. There's no planning for something like an earthquake back then. Other earthquakes had destroyed wineries on a smaller scale previously, like Pierre Colombet's winery in the Warm Springs district of Fremont. We covered it in episode 29, but it was destroyed by the previous Great Quake of 1868 and later purchased by Leland Stanford and run by his brother. Since then, there have been the Loma Prieta Quake of 1989 that rocked the Santa Cruz Mountains wineries, and the 2014 Napa Quake during harvest also. None of the others have approached the destruction of the 1906 quake. Obviously, there was much more terror and destruction in the city at large, and there's a lot more you can read to get a better version of the larger picture. I'm really just looking at it through a wine lens here. San Francisco did have some underground cisterns at the time, but would greatly expand that project. Their location is easy to see now. Just look for a large circle of bricks in the street, most commonly in a large intersection. There's one you drive right over if you've ever gotten on the Bay Bridge at Harrison and 1st Street in San Francisco. Next time, we'll see how the CWA rebuilds from losing 10 million gallons of wine, plus a massive amount of infrastructure. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs like travel, research book purchases, things like that. Any amount is appreciated. I have a small token of my appreciation to send to you also if you do. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with part 5. Have a good one.